everybody says, oh, Stalingrad's a huge turning point. I don't think it is, actually. If it hadn't been Stalingrad, it would have been somewhere else.
You could say that in those, at least in the first week, they could have just packed their bags and walked across the Soviet opposition because they simply outnumbered them by a truly substantial margin.
You got descriptions again from the kessel of saying, look, we can hear the artillery, we can see the flashes on the horizon, and you get this situation where suddenly it goes very calm and people realize that it's over.
So let's just say they get between 150 and 200,000 men out.
Do you think?
If you do it early enough,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, before the jaws close.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how he ended up in Stalingrad.
And he didn't make it out.
No. 91,000 prisoners were taken. We have no idea whether he was among them, and about 5,000 came back.
It's the 24th of December, 1942, Christmas Eve, and in the depths of the ruins of Stalingrad, all German hope has been extinguished. Since late November, the German 6th Army had been trapped, stuck in an encirclement of Soviet forces nicknamed the Kessel, or Cauldron. Adolf Hitler's message to those inside could not have been clearer. Hole up and hold position in Fortress Stalingrad, relying on supplies from the Luftwaffe above. Yet, by mid-December, thousands of his men were both starving and freezing to death. So, Operation Winter Storm was launched from the outside, led by Field Marshal Manstein, with the hope of breaking through the Soviet ring and forging a rescue. Panzer groups made it fairly close to the perimeter, but a subsequent stalemate meant that by Christmas Eve, for those inside, it was clear that nobody was coming to save them. I'm Darryl Morris. This is Times Radio History. Merry Christmas and welcome to a special edition of History Undone, the show where we look at the briefest of moments and how they can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether those split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, we're asking, what if the German forces stuck within Stalingrad had managed to break out or been rescued in Operation Winter Storm? This is the question for our experts. And joining me today as ever, the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, and returning to the channel is the senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy, Dr. Klaus Schmider. Klaus, welcome. Chris, welcome. Thank you both for being with us. Okay, let's start. Let's sort of briefly build up to that era in 1942. Klaus, can you sort of take us into Stalingrad and how we got there?
Okay. Come the spring of 1942, the German Army High Command engages in a bit of number crunching and realizes that the continuation of the war in Russia will only be possible if all resources are concentrated on one of three army groups. So you face the stark choice of shutting down, shall we say, the war down here, the eastern borders of Ukraine, approaches to Moscow, or Army Group North outside Leningrad. So two of these will have to be shut down. There's no way of telling for how long. All the resources, especially supporting air power and tanks, will have to be pooled in one army group. In the end, the decision is made to shift everything to the south. The idea being is to race down the Caucasus to make it as far as the oil fields of Baku, which are just outside this particular map. Now, this is a huge distance, and crucially, as you progress down south, it will leave you with a long, wide open eastern flank. To cover that, a beeline is made for the city of Stalingrad on the western bank of the Volga River. The idea is to use this as an anchor and possibly later jumping off point for a second phase offensive into Kazan. Number of problems with this. We are talking about even using Stalingrad as an anchor, you're still talking about a very long northern and then eastern flank, which you will struggle to cover. The only reason this was made possible is by enlisting further help from the European Axis allies. Army Group South goes into this campaign with 2 Romanian army commands, a Hungarian army command, and an Italian army command, which has just been beefed up from the corps that it originally was in 1941. If, for instance, the decision had been made to focus on Moscow, the distances involved would have been much smaller, and such an offensive would have been feasible without so much foreign input. But as it was, this particular operation was only made feasible by Axis contribution. And granted, these armies, even with the best will in the world, usually do not have the force structure to stand up to a focused, full-blown Red Army counterstrike.
Okay, and nice, because we'll come back to that in a moment, and obviously that's where we're heading. Chris, is it also worth us understanding, on this brilliant map, by the way, our classic map of Europe, is it worth us understanding what Stalingrad sort of meant to the Germans, meant to Hitler? And actually, I mean, there's a feeling, right, that it was maybe an unnecessary target, really.
Well, as Klaus said, if you don't cover this angle here, you're going to leave your army group. And one of the things we've got to bear in mind is that army group is split into 2. Army Group A, Army Group B. Army Group B is designed to provide security in this area here, principally centered on Stalingrad. Army Group A is to go down and do the business here with the oil fields. And I think what's worth bearing in mind here is the motivation. And that is the fact that Hitler always thought about economic issues as being strategic issues. His generals wanted to capture towns, cities, all that sort of thing, but he was thinking economic. So if you look at the original plan for Barbarossa, for example, he saw how Leningrad was so important. He saw how Ukraine was very important with oil and gas, grain, all that sort of thing. So this is about energy, getting the oil that the Axis desperately needs and denying it to the Russians. If you can cut the Russians off from their oil, all these other operations become very difficult indeed. We also have to remember that the 1942, Germans having a pretty good time of it. Rommel is successful in North Africa. He's captured Tobruk. In the Atlantic, we're losing huge amount of shipping to the U-boats. So they're on a bit of a high. And as we've seen in the previous year, this is a happy hunting ground for the Germans. They always capture huge and destroy huge numbers of Russian armies here in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are essentially on their side as well, so they don't have all the partisan activity. And as Army Group South comes down here, they absolutely destroy Russian armies centered at the Battle of Kalach. So they're on a real high by the time they get down here. And of course, everybody notices that if you are able to capture Stalingrad, the whole of the Volga River is then impassable. You can't actually get supplies up from Persia. All the Lend-Lease stuff is coming through Persia, past the Caspian, up the Volga to supply Moscow as well.
Okay.
So
more than just the name.
Yeah, I mean, you can call it almost anything. It was called something else beforehand. It only becomes an issue once you center on it. But the key point about Stalingrad is it dominates the lower Volga here. It basically interrupts, the aid, as I said, the Lend-Lease coming, and it anchors the northern flank of Army Group B that's operating in the Caucasus.
Okay, so the Axis forces, German forces, have Stalingrad west of the river, and the Soviets need to counter. They need to launch a massive operation to counter. Take us into how the encirclement comes about, Klaus.
The Germans have a hard time of the city fight. In theory, if it had been just about cutting off the Volga, they could have established a lodgment to the north and just to the south of the city, and with that, you cut off the Volga traffic. You don't absolutely have to go into the city nice to have. Don't get me wrong, leaving the city in Soviet hands means they have a bridgehead on the western side. But the key rationale is that at the time this happens, in August 1942, as Admiral Parry was saying a moment ago, they're still on a high. So far, the war, even in 1942, has been good for them. They've been going from strength to strength, success to success. And the problem is that if you want to jump the Volga, which is 2 miles across, you need the jetty in the center of Stalingrad, because the jetty, surprise, surprise, is actually level with the water. Couple of miles upriver, couple of miles downriver, you have towering cliffs. Mm-hmm. And that dip in the terrain is mirrored by another similar dip on the far side, the eastern side of the Volga. So you actually need that embarkation point if you are still toying with the idea of jumping the Volga and driving into Kazan one day. And that in turn means you need the city.
And so, Chris, help us understand what's going on in and around Stalingrad, or around Stalingrad, because that's just as important, isn't it?
Yeah, the key operational concept here is that Army Group A goes and does what it's supposed to do and try and seize the oil fields. More difficult than you might think. Army Group B, which also consists of the 6th Army that is in Stalingrad, is operating to the north here. But the critical thing here to remember is that Stalingrad isn't just a garrison. There is a mobile defense of all the other forces that are in Army Group B, designed to screen it, protect it, provide reconnaissance, and obviously stop any threats coming near Stalingrad. But there's a problem. In coming down all this way, they haven't yet established the ports in the Black Sea to provide support. The panzers and quite a lot of the transport are overdue for maintenance. And this area here is not great in terms of fertility. And if you look at the amount of potatoes, for example, that are produced in that area, not very high. So they've already arrived with not much fuel, not much in the way of rations. And the area here, and let's remember that German forces were encouraged to live off the land. There's not much in the way of food supplies in the local area here, so they haven't been able to deal with that. They've brought a lot of horses with them. They haven't got the fodder for the horses, so they actually send the horses and mules away to Rostov, most of them. Right. So they can't tow their artillery around when they're in Stalingrad and in this area as well. So, I think, Klaus, you know about this. There's a huge logistics problem in terms of actually keeping Army Group South, which became A and B, and the Stalingrad garrison supplied.
There is a logistics issue even before the Soviet encirclement. The chief logistician of Army Group A, a gentleman by the name of Weinknecht, really,
of course,
rather obviously, easily the most, let's say, military Germanic name you can think of. He pens a memo in late October 1942, where he states unambiguously, we need to pull away from the Volga. And this is not because he is in possession of you could say, privileged intelligence on the Soviet plans for Uranus. He is just working off the numbers which the logistical resupply of 6th Army is requiring in this current final phase of the city fight. Nothing more. So if anything, if this were to escalate, the requirements would go up. So his estimates are, if anything, on the low side. But the logistical arrangements are, you could say, a very awkward combination of road, rail, road again, some rail more. It takes forever to fix a blown Don bridge. It takes forever to re-gauge the main railways. Much of this is still work in progress in 1942. And he states unambiguously, we need to pull away from the Volga. I cannot guarantee the resupply of 6th Army in place for late autumn and winter, 42, 43, the way things are right now. And this is somebody who has access to the big decision makers.
I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that the nearest railhead is actually 75 miles away. So you have to unload from a single rail line that comes towards the Don here, everything onto mules, camels, actually, they use camels here, but also the trucks that they've got, that's buying up fuel as well. So everything, if it doesn't come by air, has to come from that railhead 75 miles away.
So, okay, so that's the context inside Stalingrad and around the logistical challenges. The Russians next launch Operation Uranus, Chris.
Yeah, and essentially what had happened was that instead of anticipating this drive down to the south, the Soviets actually thought that it was going to be a drive on Moscow again to repeat what had happened the previous year. So they've got to redeploy quite significantly down here. But what they managed to do is build up a very large number of troops, nearly 1 million to the north and east here. They conceal them really well. They don't conduct the sort of reconnaissance activity that you'd expect from an approaching army group or anything like that. And they position themselves quite sensibly opposite, essentially, the Romanian troops. And they've already sussed out the Romanians aren't up to speed, as Klaus said earlier on. They've got good intelligence that the officers don't go patrolling with their men, for example. And there's a real gap between the command and what is going on. And basically, to the northwest and also to the south, they've got these Romanian troops, and they think that if they can do a double encirclement round Stalingrad, they can cut off the Sixth Army from any outside interference. They've already realized that the rest of Army Group B is dispersed, isn't able to put together a very fast reaction to that, and they plan for this, and they come down to the south, and they're ready to do this double encirclement.
And Klaus, that's very effective.
It is stunningly effective. It's also, I dare say, the only instance I can think of where in the 20th century an offensive operation was deliberately timed to coincide with a low-pressure front in order to keep superior enemy air power on the ground. The Russians were past masters at long-range weather forecasts at the time. Wow. And quite a few historians dispute that. They do insist, in fact, that it was the Soviet original intention to have clear skies for the day of the offensive, which you normally would prioritize. Yes, I mean, you want your own close air support with you when you go over the top against a peer enemy. But if you look at the statistics for air combat in the previous 6 weeks in this particular sector of the front, it's 3-1, 4-1, 5-1 in the German favor. Oh. And I can see why somebody would, at least initially, try and dodge that particular blow. Now, don't get me wrong, the Germans did something similar in the Battle of the Bulge. The Chinese did something similar in Korea in late 1950. In both cases, it ended in tears because these campaigns or these campaign phases were, shall we say, more open-ended. Here, what you really need is 5 or 6 days of really lousy weather before the pincers close to the west of Stalingrad at Klaus. And it worked. It worked. I'm convinced it was deliberate.
Wow, okay. It's fascinating. Okay, so the Sixth Army are encircled in Stalingrad. Let's zoom in now and take a look at the action within the encirclement itself. So let's talk about what's happening inside the kessel and how close Operation Winter Storm really came to breaking through. Klaus, you have provided this absolutely incredible map. And what we've got here, I guess, is the incredibly effective Operation Uranus that has encircled Stalingrad. That's what we can see here, right? Mm-hmm. Talk us through this.
Yeah, it's a very detailed map from the German official history. Just 13 volumes, no household should be without one.
Yeah.
I had to slip this one in. And you have a total of 20 divisions caught up here. The figures are difficult to calculate for the very simple reason that it's not just 6th Army caught in the Kessel, but also fragments, elements of 4th Panzer Army, And at the same time, a few bits and pieces of 6th Army were left outside the Kessel. And then you have elements of, you could say, Romanian, Croat, and Italian contingents also caught up. So the exact figures are impossible to arrive at. Best estimates are usually around 240,000, 250,000. And 20 divisions, and this is huge, okay? Or rather, this has the potential to be a major, major earth-shattering defeat.
It's worth noticing that it's actually 60 by about 40 kilometers. That is not a small area. As Klaus says, you've got 20 divisions in there, but you've also got 2 airfields there and there, which are actually still in contact with the outside world. But the key problem here, and this is where I think General Paulus would have been pretty frustrated, is the security of this area around here is the responsibility of 48 Panzer Corps, part of Army Group B, and they can't get their tanks moving. They've had their wires completely frozen. They don't have the lubricants that can actually get their vehicles going, and they are totally immobilized. And they, if you like, are the screening guard that stops this encirclement happening. So instead of having an active defence outside, a mobile defence, you've got a situation which doesn't suit the Germans at all, is where they're fixed in position. These are manoeuvre forces. The whole doctrine is to do with manoeuvre. And the other thing was, they expected to live in Stalingrad. That was the original function. It was going to be a city that they would capture quickly, and you wouldn't be actually living in ruins and things like that. We'd actually be living in real buildings, and we'd be able to sort of defend it.
And it's worth us considering, Klaus, the conditions inside here. Absolutely brutal.
They are going to be absolutely appalling within 7-8 days, because the army was already living a hand-to-mouth existence prior to the encirclement. Now, on D+3 of the Soviet operation, once their pincers close in at a place called Kalash here, you have to rely on resupply by air. There is a precedent for this, the siege of Demyansk, in early 1942, but there...
This is up near Leningrad.
Yeah. And there you had a fair-sized corps isolated, and it was successfully resupplied. This is a force about 4 times as strong. So we are really talking about a completely different proposition. And then crucially, as Admiral Parry already alluded to, we have got a very substantial encirclement. And that means that, say, you have a plane load of anti-tank shells arriving in good order, well, you still have to distribute them. And granted, you still have quite a few trucks, but with every passing day, you're going to have less and less fuel for those trucks.
And it's cold. And you've got snow blizzards, and you've got weather, and you have Soviet Air Force active now in the region. So it's incredibly difficult. I mean, the discussion that takes place back at Hitler's HQ is, yeah, we can resupply from air. And as Klaus said, with the Demyansk incident up near Leningrad, you had a situation where 90,000 troops were surrounded. They were supplied by the Luftwaffe. There's no question about that. Also, interestingly, a general who is in command of 51 Corps here in Stalingrad, Seydlitz Kurtzberg, actually undertakes a mission to actually punch out a corridor to get a relief force through. Right. So he's actually there, and he said, well, yeah, okay. He's probably said to Paulus, we've done this before. And the Luftwaffe on that occasion had sufficient capacity to actually airlift supplies and troops in to deal with that. Now, when Stalingrad is initially surrounded, Hitler and his generals say, well, it's only temporary. This is not going to go on forever. We're going to sort something out here. So therefore, let's do that. And he says to Goering, can you do this? And Goering says, how much? And they say, it's about 750 tons a day. And he says, we can do that. My staff tell me we can do that. And in fact, the head of the German general staff, Zeitzler, says, there's no way you can do that. You're lying. And Hitler actually says, I believe Goering at this point. And Zeitzler at that point says, in that case, I'm going down to the same rations that people are eating in Stalingrad. And he loses nearly 25 pounds in the space of 3 weeks until Hitler tells him to get back at the table. But the army and the Luftwaffe at this stage really don't believe that they're in agreement. And if you look at the statistics of it, given the weather conditions, and they've only got about 100 transport aircraft. They had many more at Demyansk, and this is not going to be something that can run. And I think people don't have, as Klaus said, a real perspective on how big this area is and the distribution issues associated with it. It's also an absolute shambles when they come to actually load the planes. As a situation, it's rather reminiscent of the Berets arriving at Arnhem when they resupply there, where you get 5 tons of marjoram and pepper arriving. And the logistics guy says, what are we supposed to do? Fire this at the Soviets? And so it's a complete shambles in terms of resupplying. And all the while, of course, the Soviets are closing this ring, tightening it even further, and trying to get within range of being able to use artillery, particularly the Stalin organ missiles, on these airfields here to isolate it even further.
Right. I was sort of racking my brains and trying to think why Hitler would have made that kind of decision. Why would he have told them to stand firm under the circumstances? But you can sort of see if he's being told that on the one hand feels it's temporary, feels it's not going to last forever. Bit of hubris in there as well for good measure.
It's got Stalin's name in it. We can't possibly lose that.
Absolutely, that's clearly very key. There is a moment, Klaus, though, isn't there, in sort of November, where actually those in the Sixth Army are thinking maybe they could make a move.
Yes, they. Initially, in the first few days, they're actually making the first moves to break out during the night of November 25th to 26th. And the big thing, well, there's one thing against them, and there's one thing operating in their favor. The key thing in their favor is that the Soviets had blundered in terms of their intelligence appreciation. They had the idea that they would be facing a garrison of 80 to 90,000 men. And needless to say, as they tore through the German lines here, they captured assorted HQ posts, seized paperwork, began interrogating a couple of seniorish prisoners, and the picture that emerged was that they had a tiger by the tail. So you could say that in those, at least in the first week, they could have just packed their bags and walked across the Soviet opposition because they simply outnumbered them by truly substantial margin. What is against them is that at the time, and the army group commander, Weichs, who's the Manstein's predecessor, stated quite unambiguously, we're not in a position to meet them halfway. Okay, we do not have a force which we can assemble in a hurry and do a kind of sally in order to receive them. They will have to cross all this terrain by themselves.
And they don't have the fuel, they don't have the rations. Quite a lot of the armaments, basically, you look at the grease on them, it's frozen. They've got about 70 tanks. And frankly, if you're looking at going down all this way and you've just seen a double encirclement, do you really want to be caught out here in the open? Regardless of how many troops you've got, this is going to be a headlong rush this way. And so, Hitler himself said, hold tight, we're going to help you. And you look at the letters coming from inside the Kessel, they simply say, we believe in the Führer, he's going to rescue us.
Okay, and that does happen, doesn't it? Or at least there's an attempt for it to happen. And the Germans launch Operation Winter Storm. Klaus, take us into the beginning of that.
Well, but now a new army group has been created, Army Group Don, which is, you could say, slipped in to occupy a position between the old Army Group A and the old Army Group B.
But they're the same troops.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. You have a new HQ. You have a new HQ
just
staff.
Rearranging the deck chairs.
Rebranding.
Yeah. But you've got somebody like Manstein in charge, and I dare say, and don't get me wrong, I think we at Sandhurst, we could do a good job of using him as an example for the pros and cons, the ups and downs, the challenges and pitfalls of senior leadership. Because I genuinely believe that he was absolutely born for this job, the way some people are born to be concert pianists or brain surgeons. And at the same time, from a moral point of view, he was an absolute lowlife. But that's by the by. He's really, really very good at his job. However, Stalingrad and Wintergewitter, that's going to be his absolute nadir. He's going to expend an awful lot of ink in his memoirs to muddy the waters on this particular issue. And the idea is that, the initial idea at least, is that as he arrived, he put it to the command of 4th Panzer Army that I want to relieve these guys going by this route, okay? An almost straight line from west to east, because it's the shortest route. And Hoth, who is in charge of 4th Panzer Army, tells him, you can forget about it. We have got hordes and hordes of Soviets in front of us. The terrain is all wrong. They'll see us coming. We might just get there, but it will be an absolute bloodbath. You need to take the long way. You need to take the long way. You need to come up from the south. And that's like 2.5 times the distance. But you will have surprise on your side. Terrain is also slightly better. This might be a realistic possibility. We will, however, also have a supporting strike coming directly from the west.
There's also another issue. They're picking up indications that the Soviets are building for another attack, which was called Operation Saturn. And they're worried about that coming down here and encircling them as they go forward. We'll see what happens with Saturn. It becomes little Saturn later, but they are already picking up that. So if the Soviets manage to come down here, not only do they encircle any relief force, they then become a threat to what's further south as well. The remains of Army Group A are still there. And so they're worried about that. And that becomes an issue associated with how they actually approach this. They're trying to cover all the angles, because what you can do, of course, is about face to the right. And if you're actually challenged by something, you can deal with it. And as Klaus says, the terrain here is better for that and for the 3 Panzer divisions that they've got with them. They've actually brought one from France to actually help. 6th Panzer division has actually come from France, and they're obviously unloading and getting ready for this. They've also got an Italian 8th Army here and a Romanian army with them as well.
In any case, always still going to be a mountain side. When you look at this and we'll come to our undoing this moment and consider what might have happened, but it just feels like a insurmountable mountain.
It is a seriously under-resourced operation. The force that will actually deliver most of the punch, that's 2 Panzer divisions, just 2, one of them already badly knocked about, and with 2 Romanian divisions for flank cover. The 3rd Panzer Division only joins the force on the 17th of December, which is pretty late. An operation of this scope, you needed like 5 or 6 Panzer Grenadier divisions to have a better than 50-50 prospect of success. This, even if you catch the Russians by surprise, I dare say that your chances of pulling this one off are barely in the region of 10%. And in fact, there's even a good chance that as you reach the kessel, you will just join the garrison in there.
You're just putting more people into the pot.
By Christmas Eve, Chris, it's over.
I think it was over when the jaws of Uranus actually closed, to tell you the truth. But in terms of any hope, you got descriptions again from the Kessel of saying, look, we can hear the artillery, we can see the flashes on the horizon, and you get this situation where suddenly it goes very calm and people realise that it's over. And you're absolutely right. At some stage, and I don't know whether you agree with this, Klaus, Manstein says, I'm going to lose a lot more here if I continue. Or if we don't withdraw and actually re-establish ourselves. And of course, Manstein then pulls off afterwards an amazing trick to be able to get out of here and then defeat the Soviets again. But they leave it here. But what's important is what's going on in Berlin at the time. Hitler in 1938 was famous for saying, look, garrisons aren't important. They're not important if you look at the overall strategic picture. And he almost comes to the conclusion that that's a case here in Stalingrad. This is a tactical issue. It doesn't affect the strategic. Of course, it does. But his view is it doesn't affect the overall strategic plan. That's what troops are for.
Right. Interesting. So the months that followed then were surrender, capture, death for those Sixth Army who were trapped in Stalingrad. Klaus, if you don't mind me asking, you had family members.
Yeah, the brother of my father, my uncle Horst Schmider. He was a doctor there. He was a student of medicine in Germany. This is one of the few university careers which allowed you to dodge military service in a perfectly legal way because doctors were needed. And he actually had the opportunity to skip this one. But he said, oh God, I want to get these 6 months I have to do of military service out of the way. Still working as a doctor in field hospitals. So again, I want this done with. I want it out of the way. And I would like then to be able to crack on with my academic studies in good time. And that's how he ended up in Stalingrad.
And he didn't make it out?
No. 91,000 prisoners were taken. We have no idea whether he was among them, and about 5,000 came back. And keep in mind that there were allegations after the war that there was like a death march of the prisoners in the days after the surrender. But I would just caution against rushing to hasty judgments. Keep in mind that the majority of these people were like emancipated. They were like on the very verge of starvation.
I mean, quite a lot of them turned up in Moscow in a victory parade, didn't they, the prisoners? So you could count quite a few of those.
If it's the one that is done in the summer sunshine, that would have been after the destruction of Army Group Center. I'm not entirely sure they used Stalingrad survivors for a victory parade in Moscow, probably because they were literally too emancipated. But yeah, you have literally an entire army command vaporized. Because just a few thousand are wounded or are deemed to be of critical enough importance to warrant a place on one of the planes that took out men rather than bringing some in.
Thank you for sharing that, Klaus. That then is the real and brutal history of what happened inside the kessel of Stalingrad in the run-up to Christmas. Now, let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. Now, let's get into what we love doing here on History Undone. Ask ourselves some of those long-term questions. Had the Germans broken out of the encirclement at Stalingrad, or had this story gone differently in any other way? What happens? Chris, I caveat that point because we've sort of considered Winter Storm as being, just almost certainly doomed. Is there any way through at any point here, Chris, for the Germans?
Well, I think you've got to go back. Before the encirclement associated with Operation Uranus, with the Russians, Soviets flooding down, the Romanians on both flanks were saying, we're picking up indications here that there are quite a lot of Soviets coming our way. And the Germans ignored them, totally ignored them. I think the only way this becomes a score draw rather than a win from the Germans is if they detect that movement down, which is huge. Let's face it, it is huge. And they're able to put in position the mobile forces to be able to deal with those as they come down either side of Stalingrad. Because the one thing you don't do in the face of the enemy, and this is something that the Soviets really should have learned from their previous mistakes, is you never divide your forces. You concentrate and really hit hard with your counterattack or attack. So had the Germans been in a position to deploy from Stalingrad, those that could, and also bring in the rest of Army Group B to deal with it, then, as I said, you might have got a situation where even the Russian armies and, the Soviet armies couldn't actually supply themselves either for a stage. This had to be a lightning quick blitzkrieg from the Soviet side. If it didn't work, they themselves were in logistics difficulties as well. The other problem, which Klaus alluded to earlier, is the fact that, German aviation wasn't as dominant in the latter stages as it should have been. Quite a lot of it, the aircraft were grounded because they had the wrong types of lubricant in. They had to actually light fires underneath some of their aircraft to actually get them going, to get them started. The Soviets, on the other hand, had really got this hacked, particularly after the Battle of Moscow that had taken place, which showed how they needed to be prepared for the winter. And the one thing I think we haven't mentioned in all this, of course, it is the depths of winter. It's cold, there's snow on the ground, and there's real problems associated with everything you're doing in this situation. So had the Germans been able to block, I think, the twin arms of that, you basically get, as I said, a score draw at that point, and then you get Army Group A coming up from the south in force, actually may be able to do something about that.
Okay. That's the only way through, Klaus. I mean, is there any way that the Sixth Army are encircled in Stalingrad and find their way out?
I must say, I agree with Admiral Parry's assessment. This sort of thing might just about have worked. But in the aftermath, we're still talking about, even if you have managed to block this particular operation, the position at Stalingrad is still untenable. You're still talking about packing your bags, and this in good time and in good order, but you're still talking about contracting your position, about shrinking it. And yes, the moment you start to move away from Stalingrad, you're talking about pulling back Army Group A from the deep Caucasus here, which is what this operation was all about.
Stalingrad puts the cork in the bottle. That's the point. I mean, my view, Klaus, is from a military point of view, you actually consolidate here. You actually withdraw down in here, make it defensible. You start getting reinforcements from Romania across the Black Sea, and actually that becomes, and as you know, the whole issue down here with the Voronezh front attacking Army Group B, if that had not been successful in taking out the Italian 8th Army, then Manstein wouldn't have felt threatened in his flank and could have withdrawn in good order, probably taking the garrison with him, as long as they had blunted the two arms of Uranus.
Or even one arm. That might even have been enough. But at the end of the day, you're still left with, shall we say, severe indentations in the original line that gave you the hold on Stalingrad. You're still left in a position where you kind of have a grip on Stalingrad, and you still have an overland communication, but you can easily tell that if the Soviets try this one more time, maybe 3 or 4 weeks down the line, you're facing a major crisis.
So wait, are we saying then that we can leave Stalingrad, retreat from Stalingrad, and still hold the Caucasus?
No.
And still get what we need out of the Caucasus?
I think it would be difficult.
Not forever. I mean, it depends what you think you can do. As Klaus and you both know, they're having a pretty hard time of it up here, the Germans as well. So they haven't got a lot of resources. The only way you're going to do it, Manstein manoeuvres pretty well later in the Kuban, of course, and is very successful in this region here. So my view is that had they actually thought about it and got a good supply line going across the Black Sea here, it is possible they could have held out there and expanded the campaign backwards towards Ukraine and maybe fought their way across there. But it's got to be supplied. That's the key point. And I think the critical issue is Romania, Black Sea area, things like that. My sense, if I look at it, I want to get all my forces together if I can. So if I'd been able to get Sixth Army to come south, the screening troops as well, I could have consolidated the position. Rostov is quite important here as a port. You've got actually quite a lot of fuel here as well. That's the other thing. Although the Soviets have destroyed by bombing the oil fields at Grozny, you've still got quite a bit in the south here. And there's a refinery there as well, which you can use.
Is there any sense in retreating from Stalingrad, consolidating, accessing the oil in the Caucasus, and then coming back for Stalingrad?
No, I think once bitten. I mean, the other thing is you've got a huge number of Soviet armies in this region now looking to swing this way afterwards. So I doubt it.
The numbers are not on your side by that point, are they really?
And crucially, looking at other theatres, you're now facing a war in North Africa.
Yeah.
On a much, much larger scale than you were only 2-3 months earlier.
In fact, Klaus, hasn't Tunisgrad happened by this time?
No.
Hasn't happened.
May 13th, 1943.
Yeah, but they're heading for that.
Yeah.
But ever since the Allies landed in Algeria and Morocco and then began their push towards Tunisia, you could say that the war in North Africa moves up in scale. Prior to that, you had a campaign where you had like 4 or 5 German divisions, max, against 5-6 British Empire divisions. It's like very personal war. I think the battalion commanders must all have been on first name terms. And after that, it really moves up a notch. You've got like more than a dozen divisions in play on each side. And here you really need resupply, which in turn, big surprise, is going to make another call on the Luftwaffe Air's transport resources.
What's interesting about the Stalingrad campaign, I feel, is that the previous year, when Barbarossa started, the Germans wanted a really quick knockout blow. And the original intention for this was actually another knockout blow for this year. Let's take the ability of the Soviets to use these oil fields and to get Lend-Lease up this way. Let's take that out of the war. And so this constant surge where you're trying to impose your will on a map without any discussion of the logistics or indeed the distances involved or the weather is something that bedevils quite a lot of these large German campaigns.
And I think I'm right in saying that in the aftermath of Stalingrad, I mean, it sort of changes the equation. It changes the psychology, doesn't it, for sure? And in terms of sort of Hitler's decision-making with regards to that as well, does a sort of draw rather than a defeat influence the way that Hitler plays out the rest of the war, his decision-making, perhaps a little bit of I mean, it was obviously an enormous morale shattering moment as well. If we don't consider it a sort of absolute defeat for the Germans,
it would still have been regarded as a setback.
There's no way they could have spun that as being...
No, I really struggle. I mean, one of the officers involved in the planning for a possible breakout suggested that as far as the Stalingrad side of things was concerned, you just issue a Wehrmacht communique that says, having destroyed the Russian industrial center of Stalingrad, 6th Army is now resuming other operations. No, you never explain, never complain. The Caucasus thing is different. You've sold this rather too openly to too many people that it's a case of 1942 Caucasus or bust. And now you're pulling back from the Caucasus, maybe still in good order, without having suffered a major defeat along the way, but it's still a pretty key piece of real estate. I mean, Baku is absolute, and I don't really care whether it's to grab it yourself or deny it to the Soviets, Baku is an enormous prize. And Hitler did sense instinctively, or at that point at least he was right, that if he were to pull away from this target, he wouldn't get another go because the strategic balance of power was tilting in the Allies' favor.
And you hear the generals saying that, if we leave Stalingrad, we'll never get back there again. Right. And I think that is part of the deterministic way in which they thought about these things.
And what does it mean, Chris, for things that came next, like Kursk?
Oh, I mean, slightly different theatre, of course. But what I think happened here is it showed how the Germans could be defeated in bulk. That's the point. I think one thing I would point out is that the Germans set themselves up for a form of campaigning here that doesn't suit them. They love mobile combined arms warfare. That's not possible here if you're locked into a city. And Hitler had learned before that if you're street fighting in cities like when they captured Warsaw, this is going to be costly, and being locked in like that is a bit of a mistake. As I said, the original intention is it's actually a barracks city. We're going to live there. That's how we're going to sit here on the Volga. And of course, the fact that the Soviets chose to contest it street by street meant that you couldn't actually live there.
Does it not change the way that the Soviets approach strategically other battles, the next battles?
Well, you've got reputations being built on the Soviet side. So you've got generals like Zhukov. Zhukov and Konev were very important up in Moscow. They're building reputation. Stalin himself now is listening to his generals. That's the key point. Before it was done very instinctively, and these generals are picking up real prestige, not just politically, but also with the troops as well. So it's really important. But when you capture 90,000 Germans and you see the state they're in, you start to think, well, maybe we can win this a bit more. But having done it once here, they start thinking about Kursk. But of course, Kursk is initiated essentially by the Germans. It's the Soviet reaction to what the Germans are going to do, and they pick up what the Germans are going to do in that salient there that actually causes Kursk to occur. I think one of the things that's really important is that the Germans constantly underestimate what they're facing, whether it's at Stalingrad or anywhere else. At the start of Barbarossa, for example, they thought the Soviets had about 12,000 tanks. They had 24,000. And they constantly underestimate, and I think Klaus will bear this out, is some of the field intelligence and some of the intelligence at the operational level was absolutely shocking. And it seemed like the German staffs always believed what they wanted to believe in support of the objective, rather than actually saying, this is what the enemy is capable of doing, now let's draw some deductions from that.
And that fundamental equation doesn't change?
I don't think so. In this particular timeline, you could even argue that Manstein's counterstrike at Kharkiv doesn't take place. The only reason, which actually gave the Soviets pause for a few months. Why? Because the only reason Manstein was able to get away with it, or rather with actually pulling back and then staging this counterstrike, is because Hitler, contrary to the facade he liked to give himself, as in, I'm the man of iron, nothing can shake me, he was in a bit of a state of shell shock for a few weeks after Stalingrad. And that gave Manstein the room to maneuver, go ahead and say, oh, I'm sure the Führer won't mind if I do the following.
I'll use my initiative.
Exactly. So if, on the other hand, you get a score draw, which is what we are imagining here, I don't think Mr. von Manstein gets the wriggling space he absolutely needed to pull off the Kharkiv counterstrike.
Yeah, that's true.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's right. I mean, the biggest problem we've got here is hubris, I think. Germans constantly thinking we've been successful, we've done it this way before. We don't really think the Russians as a nation are at the same level as we are in terms of racial sort of equality. And of course, the big shock is they're being rolled over now in ways in which they didn't think they would be. And I think, as Klaus says, Hitler's shocked by that. I think the top generals are shocked. And of course, by this stage, of course, Hitler has taken over, frankly, as the supreme commander as well.
So just to be clear, the lack of that shock, if we don't have that shock that ricocheted through the rest of the war, that was a major turning point, the reality is that... To
tell you the truth, if I can interrupt, Darryl, I don't think it is a turning point, actually, to tell you the truth. There's a lot more going on, as Klaus said,
or
in
maybe
North Africa.
It's a psychological turning point.
No, in some ways, but without Stalingrad, does it alter the course of the war? I don't think so.
The problem is the hubris, right? The problem is that actually all of those minerals, they're all still present, aren't they? All of those character traits are still present.
Yeah. So I think that's the issue. Funnily enough, everybody says, oh, Stalingrad's a huge turning point. I don't think it is, actually. If it hadn't been Stalingrad, it would have been somewhere else. That's my point. There's a lot going on, Army Group centres under real pressure at this point. I would say it was distinctive, but not decisive.
Timeline then? I mean, the obvious sort of next conclusion is that maybe it prolongs the war?
It has the potential to prolong the war, at least by a few months.
So we're thinking months, really?
Yeah, not more.
The fact of life is, if you string your armies out on the end of a huge piece of distance here, you can't supply them with the means to actually conduct fighting power, you're going to end up with this situation where they become hostages in enemy territory, particularly if you underestimate the huge resources that the Soviets have in terms of population and the way they can generate all the sort of fighting power of their own in this area here. You've got all the railways here, you've got centralized lines here, and on internal lines you can deploy in any direction. And I'm afraid the Germans never ever find a solution to covering all these distances and having enough firepower in any particular place to actually destroy the will of the Soviet people. That's the key point. You can destroy as many Soviet armies as you like. If they can replace them and the will of the people isn't broken, then you've got a problem. That's why Hitler intuitively, and I think rightly, said, if we can destroy their industry and the sources of their oil and raw materials, that'll break the will. And yet, you've got generals who are saying we're going for cities, we're going for encounter actions, we're going for encirclements, because that's what we like doing.
Yeah, okay. And I suppose that's particularly cute when you consider that your morale is you're being shaken by that, the opposite is happening. Klaus, is there... Okay, so they get out of Stalingrad at least, right? Let's consider that.
Yeah.
They are, at least the encirclement either doesn't happen for whatever reason or they manage to get out. Does it... What sort of material difference does it make?
It makes some difference. I mean, you've just rescued 100... I'm assuming that even in a best case scenario, you're going to lose quite a few men along the way. So let's just say they get something between 150 and 200,000 men out.
Do you think?
If you do it early enough, yes.
Yeah, before the jaws close.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Or literally the day after the jaws close.
Yeah.
But you have to be fast, and I don't see Paulus doing it.
No. And you don't know where the Soviets are. You don't know where they're concentrated. So which direction are you going to go in? So
the shortest, the fastest.
So you don't get flank attacked.
I mean, we are talking about the very best case contingency. Let's split the difference. Say 175,000 men. These are veterans, and frankly, that's not something to be sneezed at. I mean, quite a few of them would probably have ended up fighting in Tunisia and going into the back there.
What do you do with them?
You deploy them in any number of places. You deploy them in the gap, which has just been torn around the Don, where Italian 8th Army just collapsed.
Yeah.
Or you take them outside Moscow, where the Reshef battle is just heating up, the second Reshef battle, or you fly them into Tunisia to see if you can hold that place. And quite a few of them would have ended up in the back there.
Right. And so does it change the outcome of those?
I don't see it changing. No, don't get me wrong. It's something. It's a lot more substantial than just a nice to have. On the other hand, a game changer, no, I really don't see it. No.
I mean, the other thing we've got to bear in mind is the amount of aviation that the Germans lose in supporting Stalingrad.
True.
You've got a huge turnover here where the Soviet Air Force is starting to take out quite a lot of these transport aircraft, but also fighters and ground attack aircraft as well. So you've got whole Luftflotte that are depleted now. I think the other thing, Klaus, is where you've got divisions and what we would call brigades now on paper, they're actually down at company level in some cases. I mean, they're really depleted. I just completely worry about the idea of 175,000 people trudging through waist-deep snow in some cases. They're not in the best of shape. They've been emaciated, as you said. They don't have supplies. How are you going to actually feed these people once you get them out? I can tell you from the Falklands, we captured 15,000 Argentinian troops, and we had a real problem on day one in the cold, of course, and also trying to feed them as well. I can't imagine what you're going to do in terms of having these people away from their supplies and their logistics. What are you going to do? I don't think it's going to... I personally think that's going to be a death march myself, Klaus. It's the
Not
only
if
way
you
out.
do it straight away. But again, this takes us back to Paulus. And I would say he's not doing it, not in a month of Sundays.
This is a guy who's very particular about his uniform, about staff work. I don't think he even commanded a division before this, did he?
No, not even a regiment. But there's something else to consider. I mean, we have to be fair to these people. I mean, it's easy, you could say, look at the CV of Paulus or, for instance, of Percival. to look at a similar case and go like, oh my God, he was never more than an administrator. It was obvious he would never cut it in combat. But what is his frame of reference? And we really need to make a conscious attempt to turn our backs on what we know today.
Of course.
On the morning of, say, November 23rd, 1942, his frame of reference is what has happened since June 22nd, 1941. And yes, the Germans got a few black eyes and a broken nose along the way. But other than that, the overall balance sheet is success, success,
and
success,
big
success.
victory on the way down.
And crucially, there was at Kharkiv in May, there was a situation not a million miles removed from what he's currently experiencing, where the local army command and army group commands who were finding themselves encircled by a Soviet spring offensive were on the verge of pulling out. And Oberkommando des Heeres told them, listen, keep it together. We have information that you're not party to. We will launch a counterstrike that will back an entire Soviet army command, but we will need you to grit your teeth for another 72 hours.
Hold your nerve.
Which is what they did. Reluctantly so. Their instinct was to pull out, but then Oberkommando des Heeres was as good as its word, and they backed more than 250,000 Soviet prisoners.
Right.
And that sort of thing would have been his frame of reference. We know how the story ends. Back then, he might easily have told you, well, so you say. You keep telling me it will end in disaster. So far, I've seen nothing but runaway success. Now prove me wrong.
I mean, there is another thing with Paulus, is that quite a lot of the witnesses at the time said that actually he wasn't in charge for the last 10 days or so. It sounds to me like he's had a nervous breakdown. Right. And in fact, his chief of staff, Schmidt, is the one who is actually taking all the decisions. And you hear officers saying in some of their memoirs, it was Schmidt that was taking the decisions. It wasn't Paulus. Paulus got this nervous tic towards the end. He couldn't control his left eye. Right. And you can see him actually blinking in some of the interrogation pictures afterwards. So it may not even be Paulus himself that's making the decisions towards the end.
Okay, this has been absolutely fascinating. And I think you've hit on something so interesting, Klaus, which is that for all of us wanting to move the sort of chess pieces around our board, changing these little moments of history, there's something very key, which is frame of reference. The people who are making the decisions in our stories here have a different view of the world than we do. They perhaps have a narrower view of the situation.
We've got to see them in context, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the key point. And Klaus is absolutely right. You know, I'm afraid hindsight is always accurate.
Yeah,
you know, and we have to go back. It's like any judgment about people from a historic era. You have to see them within their own context.
Yeah, and if he's feeling as though he's had this victory already, he's seen this story before, and he knows how it ends better than how we know how it ends now, then of course he's going to make that kind of decision. Well, how fascinating. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this episode of History Undone. My thanks to Dr. Klaus Schmider and the Rear Admiral, Dr. Chris Parry, for joining me. We'll be back undoing more history very soon. In the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube. You can also listen to this and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts as well. Just search for History Undone in your podcast app. Have a wonderful Christmas, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.